This is Joseph Drust, and welcome back to another episode of Ask ZBrush. So we had a question sent in asking, any tips for cleaning up single-sided scan data? So to start off, I just have ZBrush loaded up, and I have some sample scan data here loaded in. Now this scan data was created through photogrammetry, so I went through and took a bunch of pictures and then converted those pictures to geometry. Now the scan data here is pretty clean on the diffuse texture side, but if I come over here and switch, say, the matte cap to matte cap gray and then turn off the polypaint or colorize information, you can see that the geometry for the data here isn't all that great. So this mesh has a lot of holes in it and has some other anomalies that need to be fixed before I can come through and start cleaning the sculpt up. So are there any tips on doing this as quick as possible? So the first thing we want to do is get the scan data here to a DynaMesh as quick as possible. Now once this mesh is in DynaMesh form, it's going to open up a lot more flexibility. So we can come through and change the sculptural data on the mesh, start filling in these holes, and do a whole bunch of other processes inside of ZBrush. So I'm just going to first duplicate the subtool. So I'm going to go to the subtool palette over here and just duplicate this. And this is just so I have a backup of the main tool here, so I can project back any of those details or even that color information later on. Now I'm just going to come over here and select the duplicate version, and I'm going to click the eyeball icon just to hide everything but the current subtool I have selected. Now with scan data, sometimes you can get lucky and you can just run DynaMesh and it'll give you a perfect mesh that you can then go in and start sculpting on. So to do this process, I'm just going to go to the tool palette here and go down to the geometry tab here, open this up. I'm going to locate the DynaMesh area here. I'm going to turn off blur, turn off project, set my resolution to somewhere around 512, and then click DynaMesh. Now, if you're lucky, sometimes this will just give you a perfect mesh right out of the gate. So you can see the DynaMesh went through and closed some holes, and it did give me even topology everywhere. However, the scan data, being as rough as it is, has generated a lot of issues. So you can see I have a lot of thin areas on the model here, starting to get some of that DynaMesh Swiss cheese. And you can see the back is a total mess. So I have a lot of interpenetrating geometry now, and it's just made a big mess of the model here. I could start cleaning some of this up by removing some of the geometry here, but I'm losing a lot of that sculptural information that was on the mesh, and it's not really what I'm looking for. So I'm just going to undo this here and get back to the original version of that scan data. Now, part of the reason why DynaMesh is having an issue with this model is that it's just really thin in places, and it also has this weird geometry here. So after it performs the close hole function, which is generating a watertight mesh, a lot of these areas are just too thin, so when that close holes process happens, it just doesn't have anything else to do but shoot straight across, and that's giving all those defects or artifacts. So I want to modify this mesh some to just help DynaMesh out. And to do this, I'm just going to expand or extrude this out so to give the mesh a little bit of thickness. So I'm going to go back to the tool palette over here. I'm going to go down to the geometry tab. I'm going to open up Modify Topology this time, and I'm going to run a close hole. Now this is going to generate a similar effect to what we saw with the DynaMesh, because the DynaMesh process does run a close holes process. So you can see this looks a little bit better, but if you come down to the display properties area here, open this up, and now turn on double, you're going to see I'm getting pretty much identical results to what I had with the DynaMesh. So I'm getting a lot of these thin areas here, and I'm getting this back facing coming through the front of the mesh. Now, if you turn on your polyframes now, and then turn off line, you're going to see that that close holes option I ran in the geometry modify topology area has given a new polygroup to the areas where it closed the holes. So you can see I have the scan data as one polygroup, and I have the other close holes geometry as another polygroup. So now I can take this close holes geometry, mask everything out on this model, and then move it, and that will allow me to get thickness out of this mesh. So taking that single-sided version here of the scan data and allowing me to generate a thicker version of it that will then help DynaMesh, giving it more geometry to work with and giving me a cleaner mesh. So I'm just going to mask out everything on this model except for the close holes topology. So to do this, I'm just going to come up here and select the Move Transpose Line. And I'm going to hold Control, and then I'm just going to click on the polygroup of that closed holes area. So I'm just going to click right here. Now, if you have the Move Transpose Line selected, and you hover over a polygroup, press Control and click, this is going to mask everything but the polygroup you just clicked. So you can see here, I have all the closed holes geometry unmasked, and then the rest of the scan data is masked. So that process again, I'm just going to clear my mask here. is just make sure you're in Move Transpose mode, hold down Control, and then whatever polygroup you click on, it's going to unmask that polygroup and mask everything else. So if I come across the forehead here and click, you can see it's going to mask that close holes polygroup, but it's going to unmask everything else. So now I only have the scan data polygroup selected. So this process is really handy for just coming through and isolating polygroups and masking everything else. So holding Control, make sure you're in Move Transpose, and clicking on a polygroup, and now you can see I have that unmasked close holes geometry and everything else is masked. So now I'm going to rotate to the side of the model here. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. I'm going to turn off perspective. And now with just the close holes topology unmasked, I'm now just going to draw out a transpose line like this, and I'm going to hold Shift just to lock it to screen space. I'm going to come across the middle circle here and make sure I have this middle area highlighted. I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to hold down Shift, and this is going to lock it into that horizontal axis. And I'm just going to move this out. So I'm just giving this mesh here now some thickness. Now you want to move this out quite a bit, just so you have enough thickness to play with. And now if I rotate around the model here, you can see I now have a thicker version of the mesh here. So this is going to give me more geometry for that DynaMesh process, and this is going to allow me to get a cleaner result, and I'm not going to have those back faces protruding through the model. So I'm just going to clear the mask now. I'm going to switch back to the draw mode here, and now I'm going to DynaMesh this model. So this is going to come through and just clean up any other anomalies on the mesh and give me even surface topology across everything. So go back to the Geometry tab here, open up that DynaMesh area again, make sure blur is turned off, set my resolution to say 512, and now click DynaMesh. So now, after this DynaMesh is processed, I should now have something like this. So I've achieved the first goal of taking this scan data and turning it into a DynaMesh. So now that we have a DynaMesh model here, we can start now fixing some of these other areas. So we need to close these holes out. And that's one area we need to fix next. So to do this, I'm going to go up to the subtool palette here. I'm going to click Append, and I'm just going to append in a polysphere. And this should bring a polysphere into my scene. Now I'm going to select that polysphere, and it's a little bit tiny here. So depending on the resolution of the size of your scan data, you may need to scale up the appended sphere here. So to do this quickly, I'm going to go to the Deformation tab here, and I'm just going to click Unify. And this is just going to unify that to the rest of the scene here. Now I'm going to go back to the subtool palette here and turn on that scan data again. So you can see now I have this polysphere floating on top of the scan data. I'm going to switch to the Move Transpose line here. I'm going to then change to Scale by pressing E on my keyboard. I'll click the outer red circle and just scale this down. And then I press 1 to repeat that scale, so it gets a little bit smaller. I'm going to go back to the Move Transpose mode, and then just move this over here and just embed it into that hole. So just like that. Now I'm going to switch back to draw mode. I'm going to switch to the move brush by hitting B on my keyboard, isolating by the letter M, and then clicking V. And now I'm just going to get a larger draw size here, and I'm just going to manipulate the sphere here now just to fill in that hole. So this process of taking and appending primitives and filling holes is another great way to clean up scan data. So this is just going to allow me to come through and just fill that hole there. And now the next time I DynaMesh this model here, it's going to merge these two parts together. So this is going to help out quite a bit. I'm going to duplicate that sphere again. So I have another one. I'm going to switch back to the Move Transpose line, draw it out, and then move this sphere over to this side, embed it a little bit into the surface geometry there. Switch back to the draw mode there with Move, change my brush size, and just fill in this hole as well. So just getting it so that it's embedded right into the surface. And I want a little bit of that underlying texture there. I just want to get it as close as possible here, filling that in. So now after I have those cleaned up, I can just look around to see if there's anything else on this mesh. So we have this little part here we need to clean up as well. So we'll get that in a second, but everything else looks okay. So I'm going to select the scan data again, and I'm now going to perform a merge down. So I want to merge into that polysphere and then merge into that other polysphere. So I'm going to go to the subtool palette here, open up merge, click merge down, and hit always OK to this, and hit merge down again. And now I have all those parts as a single subtool. So these parts are still separate right now, so they're not completely merged. So I just need to re-DynaMesh to merge everything back together. So to re-DynaMesh, since the scan data here already has DynaMesh active, I can just hold Control and then drag off into a blank spot of the canvas, like you're going to clear a mask, and when you release, it's going to re-DynaMesh the mesh there. So now I have reapplied that DynaMesh, and if I come in and say smooth around these edges here, you can see they're all welded tight. So I now have successfully closed those holes and sealed those up. Now I have another part here, which are this floating topology here, or these geometry anomalies. So I'm going to hit Control W just to give the entire mesh a new polygroup. And this is just going to assign a new polygroup everywhere. Then I'm going to switch to a small draw size here. I'm going to hold down a Control, and I'm just going to mask out these issues over here. So I'm just going to make sure I get all these kind of nasty lines masked out. So you can see I have some floating topology there, and I have these pinpoints. I'm just going to mask those out. And now with these masked, if I hit that Control W again, it's going to take those masked areas and give me a new polygroup. So pressing Control and W, and I have a new polygroup assigned to those areas. I can now hold Control and Shift and select that polygroup, and then select it again to hide it. And now I'm just going to left with this topology here. So I have some little more floating anomalies here. I'm just going to come through and mask these out as well. Just reapplying that masking feature just to get all that stuff that's left there. Control W to give that a new polygroup, Control and Shift, and click on that polygroup to hide it. So that's a little bit cleaner there. Now I'm going to go to the Geometry tab, go to Modify Topology. I'm going to do a Delete Hidden, which is going to remove those polygroups that I just hid. And now I'm going to re-DynaMesh again, so holding Control and dragging off on a blank spot of the canvas. And that's now going to reprocess the DynaMesh on the model. And since it had a hole in those areas, it's going to perform that close holes effect first, and then re-DynaMesh on it. So now I have successfully cleaned up that area. And I can come through now and start smoothing these out and getting them back to where they were. Now the next thing I want to do with this DynaMesh model is I want to get a flat base on this. So I don't want to have all this excess topology here happening. So I'm going to go and locate the lowest point of the scan data, which should be right there. So that is the lowest point of the scan data there. And now I'm going to select the slice brush. So I'm going to hold Control and Shift. I'm going to come over here and click. And now I'm going to select the slice curve brush. So I can drag this out, and I'm just going to position it underneath that area there. And this is going to establish a new geometry line through the model, and then it's also going to assign a new polygroup. So after I draw this out, I can hold down spacebar to move this around, and then I can release, and you can see it's going to give a new polygroup to this area, and it's going to give me a nice slice line through the rest of that mesh. So now I've just split this into two polygroups. I can now remove this base polygroup here by holding Control and Shift and clicking, and then holding Control and Shift and clicking one more time, which is going to remove that parts. So I can remove any other geometry pieces that may have been left behind. So I have some topology here that needs to get removed. So holding Control and Shift again, go back to this here. I'm going to select the Select Rectangle brush. Now drag that out, and I'm going to hold down Alt, which will hide that portion, and then click. Now I've hidden that part there. Now I'm going to delete the topology that is hidden. So go to the Geometry tab again, go to the Modify Topology area, and now click Delete Hidden. And now I've removed that excess topology. And now I'm going to simply re-DynaMesh once again. So holding Control, clicking off on a blank spot of the canvas, and that is going to reapply that DynaMesh and fill in that hole. So now I have a nice flat surface on the back of the mesh there. Now I can go through and just give this all one polygroup now by hitting Control W one more time. And you can see now I have my scan data pretty much cleaned up. So now at this stage, it is ready for some sculpting. So I can come through and start sculpting or cleaning up these areas. So I can go to say, select the clay buildup brush, come through here and start sculpting some of these areas out through here. And as you're doing this, just using smooth to come through and smooth these surfaces, scrubbing these kind of geometry places out, and then just re-DynaMeshing by holding Control and dragging off on the canvas. So that is the basic principles for this. Now there are a few more tips you can do with this to help clean up this data as well. So since we converted this to a DynaMesh, we've lost the colorize information. So if I come over here and turn on the colorize information for this model, you can see I'm not getting that texture that was originally associated with it. So I can use that texture to my advantage to help determine some of these details and find out areas that may not be existent in the geometry version of the scan data. So if I go back to the original scan data and just turn on the eyeball icon and then just turn on its colorize information, then activate Solo. I'm going to switch to, say, Skin Shade 4. You can see I have some of the details here that are in the texture of where these patterns or seam lines have happened with the folds. But if I go back to that scan data Switch back to say matcap gray. You can see they don't exist on the geometry version. So I can use that texture to help me determine where to sculpt some of those details in. Another thing right now is this mesh is pretty high. So we're up to 800,000 points here. So I can generate a lower resolution version of this DynaMesh, which will just capture most of the silhouette forms. Then I can divide the mesh up and then project those details back from the original scan. This is going to give me a lighter weight mesh to work with, and then I can make larger changes and smooth things out easier as needed. So I'm just going to re-DynaMesh this model first in a low resolution version, and then I'm going to project those colors back from the original scan. So I'm going to go down here to the Geometry tab here. I'm going to go to the DynaMesh tab again. I'm going to change my resolution to say 128. Make sure blur is off, and then I'm just going to reapply that DynaMesh. And this is now going to give me this result. So now I have a mesh with about 50,000 points. So you can see it's still capturing a lot of that silhouette detail. And now I have a lower resolution version of the model to play with. So now I can turn off DynaMesh, and I can now divide this up with traditional subdivisions. So coming over here and clicking divide, and I'm going to divide this up to somewhere around 1 million polygons. So right now we're at 800,000, and if I divide again, we're at 3 million. So 3 million should be pretty good, and I have 4 subdivisions now on this mesh. Now I'm going to come back up to the subtool palette here. I'm going to make sure I have both of the eyeball icons on for these subtools. So the scan data has its eyeball icon on, and the tool I have selected has the eyeball icon on. I also want to make sure that the colorize icon is turned on as well. Now with the cleaned up version selected, I'm now going to come down here to the project area, open this up. I'm going to change my distance to 0.1, and now I'm going to click project all. So when you click project all, it's going to look at the subtools that have the eyeball icons on, and it's going to project their information to the subtool you have selected. So this is going to take the textured and sculptural details on the original scan and project them onto my cleaned up mesh. So now click project all. So after that is processed, you should get something like this. Come over and change my matte cap back to flat color. You can see all that colorized information has been transferred over. And if I switch back to matte cap gray and then turn off colorize, you can see this is now what I have on the highest subdivision here. So it's just taken all the mesh data from that scan and now projected it back to the mesh that I've cleaned up. So now I have a lot more flexibility with this. So now I can come through and say, change my subdivision levels and come in and start smoothing out these anomalies here. And then I can turn my subdivisions back up. So you can just come through and start cleaning this up really easily now. Now, another thing that's really nice, we were talking about the colorized information and using it as a basis to help out your sculpting or cleaning up of the mesh, is if you turn on your colorized information, you can see with the matte cap gray material, it's kind of hard to read. Now, if you switch to something like flat color, you're going to get that pure data, but you're not going to be able to see your sculpting. But if you come over here and in the material palette, locate this bump viewer material and select this. Now what this material does, it's going to look at the color that's being applied to your model. So it's going to look at that poly paint and it's going to render that poly paint as a bump map. So you can see now I have the sculptural details on the mesh, but that color information is now being viewed as a bump map. So this will allow you to see the details in the color information, but it's not going to detract from you coming in and sculpting. So now I can come through and say, select the damn standard brush. I'm going to turn the Z add on. And I come through and start refining these sculptural areas on the mesh here and start cleaning this up. And start coming in and enhancing, say, these areas around the eyes and things like that. And you're just going to have a little more information to work with while you do this. Now, this isn't going to be what your mesh is going to look like because this bump map viewer is just using that color information as a texture. So if I switch back to, say, matte cap gray and turn off that colorized information, this is the actual mesh data. So it's just using that colorized information as a secondary pass to just give this effect. Now you can apply the colorized information to your model like this after you're done with the cleanup, just by coming through and using that colorized information as a mask. So I'm going to get out of the bump map material, switch back to matte cap gray. Now I'm going to scroll down here to the bottom to the masking area, open that up, and in here we have a mask by color. Now, since I have the poly paint turned on, I come over here and click Mask by Intensity, and this is going to give me a new mask based on the intensity of the poly paint. So now if I just turn off my poly paint quick by coming to the poly paint area and disabling Colorize, you should get something like this. So this is the version of the model with that mask applied. Now that it is masked out, I can now use things like inflate in the deformation panel to inflate the areas of the mesh that are not masked. So I can go to the deformation palette here and go to inflate, and I can change this. And you're going to see that this is going to inflate out those texture details. And this is going to give you a mesh version of your model that is very similar to what you were seeing with the bump map material. So now if I inflate this out a little bit and now clear my mask, this is now the geometry I'm getting. So after you've cleaned up your model, you can take that diffuse texture, mask by the diffuse texture, and then use this inflate option here to come through and add those extra details back into your sculpt. And then you can go back in and further refine those as needed. So there is a workflow that you can use to come through and clean up scan data that is single-sided and a little bit rough, and take it to a version or a mesh that is ready to be sculpted on and then 3D printed. So if you have any other questions related to ZBrush pipelines or processes, please use the hashtag AskZBrush on Twitter. Happy ZBrushing!